They will never occupy the space that they did before as being the primary outlet of liberal Democratic Party consensus making. And I do think that's a positive, because I do think that they've been a deeply destructive force and have really blocked the ideology and like a left populist class first movement that would have been the most effective challenge to Donald Trump. So I think they have nuked their credibility so much that that era is over.
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Krystal Ball. Subscribe here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Now, on Monday's edition of Morning Joe, the friendly faces of MSNBC poured gasoline on an already raging fire. I think audacity is the right word for what you're about to see. After first boosting Donald Trump's long-shot candidacy back in 2015 and 2016, turning on him bitterly for the next 8 years, then visiting him at Mar-A-Lago last week, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski pivoted to Bernie Sanders. Watch this.
I am a capitalist. I am a proud capitalist, but I am a proud capitalist with guardrails that capitalism used to have. And I understand people don't want to talk about income redistribution. I'm not a big fan of income redistribution. And I'm especially not a big fan when the income is being moved from middle-class Americans to billionaires.
Now, David Sirota was a senior advisor and speechwriter to Bernie Sanders. He reposted that clip on X with the caption, "For 30 years, the Morning Joe types have vilified a handful of us for saying this stuff. But suddenly, after a second Trump win and a ratings collapse, the Morning Joe types are saying exactly what we've been saying. Wild." So all of this has been playing out against the backdrop of Comcast announcing SpinCo, a new company that literally spins MSNBC and other cable properties into a new media venture on their own to, quote, play offense in a changing media landscape, as the president of Comcast put it in a press release last week. So about that ratings collapse David Sirota referenced, too. Adweek reported that, quote, according to Nielsen Media research data, 770,000 total viewers watched the November 18th newscast of Morning Joe. On Tuesday, though, that had dipped to 680,000. That's a 12% drop. And on Wednesday's show, they slipped 5% compared to the day before and 17% since Monday. According to the New York Post, overall, Joe and Mika, quote, delivered their lowest rated program since 2021 in the advertiser-coveted 25 to 54-year-old demographic, creating 41% on the demo and 16% in total viewers since the host announced their meeting with Trump last week. The Post also pointed out that Nielsen numbers show that as of last week, MSNBC lost over half of its audience in prime time, so at night, in the demo, while rival CNN lost 35% of its audience in the same measurement. Fox's numbers reportedly grew. Believe it or not, MSNBC launched all the way back in 1996 as a joint venture between NBC and Microsoft. That's where the MS comes from. The relationship ultimately collapsed in 2012 during the early years of Barack Obama's presidency, in part because MSNBC sought to do for the left what Fox did for the right, and that irked Microsoft. During the Iraq War, MSNBC gradually leaned left, giving hosts like Keith Olbermann room to air grievances against the Bush administration amidst the Iraq War. But it didn't start that way. Watch this clip from Democracy Now! In 2013, looking back on a 2006 dust-up between Amy Goodman and Chris Matthews over what happened to Phil Donahue at MSNBC.
I want to congratulate you, Chris, on 10 years of MSNBC, but I wish standing with you was Phil Donahue. He shouldn't have been fired for expressing an anti-war point of view on the eve of the election. His point of view and the people he brought on were
I don't know what the reasons were, but I doubt it was that.
Well, we have the NBC memo. That was a secret memo that came out that said they didn't want him to be the face of this network, an anti-war face at a time when the other networks were waving the flag.
I think you might talk about
Phil Donahue is a great
remember me when you answer.
By 2008, when the network was considering hiring Rachel Maddow, the New York Times reported, quote, for MSNBC, which has interpreted the success of Mr. Olbermann's rants against the Bush administration and other Republican targets as cause to turn its evening programming further to the left, Miss Maddow has been a relatively easy fit. All of this is to say, as 30 Rock satirized brilliantly, there's always been a bit of a tug of war inside MSNBC, and not just between the MS and the NBC, but between the left and the center. So how did Rachel Maddow end up sitting side by side covering election nights with George W. Bush's press secretary, Nicole Wallace? By 2016, news consumers had much more than cable and the broadcast networks to choose from when consuming video content. This didn't just mean MSNBC and CNN, and Fox, for example, also needed to start YouTube channels and posting their videos to social media. It meant audiences started to want something different. Here's a chart from Pew in 2015. Interestingly, revenue growth was steady, even at CNN and MSNBC, which had fared poorly compared with Fox. Both were now competing for center-left viewers. When Trump came along, people's interest in news spiked, and the secret sauce for cable networks was to occupy a niche, to swerve into one lane. Both MSNBC and CNN went anti-Trump. He lost the popular vote, of course, but by then, they knew cable news wasn't about appealing to the most people possible. It didn't matter. It was about appealing the most to the most loyal viewership possible. MSNBC started having some of its best ever years, even outpacing CNN. This is why, by the way, some MSNBC shows now even do well on the podcast charts, where news consumers are able to just get information from hosts they like and trust. And that was always Morning Joe's genius. It was always a niche, and they always knew it. It was always much more casual than most morning shows and most news shows. It was a bit more stylish and relaxed. They had their Starbucks and their iPhones out on the table. You'd catch them texting while they were on air. And this is why Joe and Mika's sudden pivot on Trump immediately caused the show to shed viewers. It broke the trust. And the trust was what they always had. It's why they did better than a lot of cable news shows. Most of America doesn't trust Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski. Most of the country doesn't really care about them. But their core, loyal audience does. And this felt like an incredible betrayal. So as all of this goes down, I wanted to bring on my friend Krystal Ball. Krystal actually worked at MSNBC during the Obama years, first as a contributor and then actually as a host. She went on to find huge success after MSNBC in independent media, culminating in the creation of Breaking Points with her co-host and business partner Sagar and Jetty. So Krystal was a leader in this media evolution. She understands both the politics and the business side and had a front row seat to all of it. Krystal Ball joins us now. Krystal, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Krystal, just refresh my memory. When did you work at MSNBC? Because I watched you all the time. I tried to watch that show as much as I could because I really liked it. Yeah, I really did.
You never confessed that to me. I never knew that.
I promise. I watch a lot of MSNBC. I always have because I was just, you know how you grow up in a family that's like CBS or NBC, like always was NBC for me. So I loved the show. But you were there. This was Obama era, right?
Yeah. So I ran for Congress in 2010, brilliant timing, Tea Party era. Didn't go so well for me in terms of getting elected, but I ended up getting media attention, and then I started going on Fox News and MSNBC, basically both networks all the time. And about, I think 2011, they offered me a contributorship, and then sometime after that, same year, probably also 2011, I ended up getting put on as one of the 4 hosts of the cycle. So I was there at the network from roughly 2011 through sometime mid 2015 is when I was there.
And you and I have been talking on Breaking Points in recent days about what MSNBC meant to the Democratic Party, and I think you have some really interesting insight on that question because you saw it from the inside. Having witnessed the kind of news gathering and the broadcasting, what did you see about how the Democratic Party itself was affected and influenced by MSNBC coverage?
Well, 2016, I think at MSNBC was a turning point as it was in much of the country, but a lot of the signs of their allegiance to establishment Democratic candidates was there for a long time, from the way they covered Occupy Wall Street to how they covered the Obama administration in just a very uncritical way, whether it was him expanding drone wars or pushing for a surge or, trying to craft new bad trade deals that were going to screw over workers. It was always geared towards how do we support this administration and how do we cheerlead for it. And I participated in that way more than I would like to acknowledge or admit. For me, there was a real eye-opening moment, though, when Hillary Clinton, it was early days, 2014, I want to say, when she was contemplating a presidential run. And I felt like it would be a disaster. I thought she was too close to Wall Street. I thought she was, the exact wrong candidate for the moment. And so I did a monologue on the show. We called them rants about how Hillary should not run. And I said, please don't run. And they let me say it. But then afterwards, I was told that if I was going to say anything else about Hillary Clinton or do any other monologue, certainly about Hillary Clinton, it had to be approved by the head of the network, which, needless to say, was not typical standard operating procedure. And, my impression was that someone from Clinton world had called them very upset. And since the network was very important to them to maintain good relationships and access in the whole Clinton world, and she was, in their view, likely to be the next president, there was a need to clamp down on any opinions that were not entirely flattering to Hillary Clinton. So obviously this kind of comes to a head in 2016 when you have the Bernie Sanders movement emerge. And rather than being below the surface, this kind of caping for the Democratic establishment powers that be became very overt. And there was, an attempt just to ignore Bernie at first. Then there was an attempt to smear him. The identity politics that has become associated with the Democratic Party was really pioneered by Hillary Clinton and then taken up by MSNBC as a weapon against Bernie Sanders. He was smeared, his supporters were smeared as sexist and racist and class reductionist, meaning they didn't care enough about these identity issues and too much about class politics. And it was very effective. MSNBC was very effective in being weaponized against that movement and making sure that Hillary Clinton won in 2016 and making sure again that Joe Biden won in 2020. So they have been, even as their ratings have never matched Fox News or come anywhere close, and oftentimes even they're getting beat by CNN, though not always, they have punched above their weight in terms of consensus making within the Democratic Party.
It's kind of funny, Krystal, because 30 Rock, an NBC show, sort of famously satirized the relationship between Comcast, NBC Universal, and NBC News and MSNBC. Could you tell us a little bit how important, just given that Hillary Clinton story, how important the business interests of NBC Universal and Comcast were to what was happening on MSNBC? It may seem like it's just a silly little write-off or whatever to have the network on there, but during the Bush era also, I just remember MSNBC playing a huge role in rallying the left. It just changed so much, it seems like, around the point of 2016. But to what degree was Comcast influencing the content and the coverage?
My sense is that for Comcast, MSNBC was really a blip on the radar. In terms of their bottom line, it was quite inconsequential. So their greater corporate interests were in maintaining those relationships with the Democratic establishment. So, for example, even if, and I think that's quite likely, they would have gotten higher ratings by taking seriously the Bernie Sanders movement being a place where the divides between the establishment and left populism were aired out, and where a variety of views from within the broader left universe were aired, I think that would have led to better ratings and better business success. Mm-hmm. But in terms of Comcast's overall business interests and their executives' class interests, obviously that was not beneficial. So in a strange way, because MSNBC wasn't that important to Comcast's bottom line, it became more of a priority, in my sense, to make sure those class interests and access was ultimately maintained. And so, the two real components of MSNBC and of the worldview that they espoused and aggressively enforced during the Trump years were, number one, Trump was the main character, everything centered around him, how you feel about him. Politics was defined in relationship to whatever you thought about the person of Donald Trump. That's how you end up with Nicole Wallace, who obviously comes out of the Bush administration and a Iraq War cheerleader, how she ends up being a hero. And anyone who would be critical of the Democratic Party and their approach to Trump, from the left, would become a villain. And then the other piece was that in addition to Trump being central, they believed and enforced this worldview that the way to defeat him was effectively the kind of Liz Cheney model of politics, where you have an anti-Trump coalition. The material issues are not important, at best. At worst, they're a distraction from the main goal of unifying this coalition behind the defeat of Donald Trump. And, I think both of those pillars of the MSNBC worldview have now just basically been detonated. Number one, by Trump winning, and then number two, by Joe and Mika abandoning their Trump resistance and making a big show of going down to Mar-a-Lago and talking about how they're going to find common ground with a man that they just recently called effectively Hitler. So one doesn't normally think of hey, let me reach across the aisle and make common cause with Hitler. So, that I don't think that they realized how much that completely nuked the MSNBC audience, who genuinely believed that they were kind of fierce resistance fighters in this movement together, opposed to someone that, they believe, and many people, myself including, believe is, a fascist and has these fascistic and authoritarian tendencies. And so in this one fell swoop, they not only had their worldview crushed by Trump's victory, but then they had their authenticity, their credibility with their audience crushed by Joe and Mika's brazen act of capitulation.
I remember during the Bush years, you had like Ed Schultz and a very different, I would say, version of Rachel Maddow doing this genuine, almost genuine leftist, which is funny to say because they worked at Comcast, but like this genuine leftist approach to war. I mean, it was so opposed to Bush that it was made fun of all the time. It was like those latte liberals watching their MSNBC, like blah, 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 never get out into real America. But what was interesting about that is none of it. I'm curious if you saw any of this among the opinion hosts. They also began to create worldviews that revolved around Donald Trump. It was almost like their views shifted, and I don't think anyone told them to do that. I think maybe their views legitimately did shift to the point where you could have Rachel Maddow sitting next to Nicole Wallace, and not in a way that it's like, hey, we hashed out our differences about war crimes, but like just as though nothing ever happened.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest with you, I was not really an MSNBC viewer in the Bush years, but I think there was the unifying force there that kind of organically cropped up because it was a need in the marketplace, and Keith Olbermann seized on this moment of being, against the Iraq War, and that did well for ratings. But the unifying force there was George W. Bush, and so Jeremy Scahill, who co-founded DropSite with our friend and colleague Ryan Grimm, he talks about how during the Bush years he was a regular on MSNBC. He would come on and oppose Bush era war crimes and lies and unnecessary wars and all of those things. And then the moment that it was the Obama administration and he came on with a very similar critique of, say, for example, expanding the drone war, he was no longer welcome on the network. I think the commitment to Democratic Party partisan cheerleading becomes very apparent and undeniable post 2016. But in a sense, I think it was there all along. And you could see it also in the coverage of Occupy Wall Street, which by and large, with very few exceptions, was either non-existent, even though this was an incredibly important social movement that continues to have reverberations through this day, or it was very contempt-filled and condescending. So, the elements were there the whole time. It just became more and more obvious as time went on, and you had things like, Nicole Wallace getting primary slots, and Joe Scarborough, who was a Republican, becoming perhaps the most consequential star on the network, and becoming the Joe Biden whisperer and lying to the audience also about things like Joe Biden's fitness, as it became manifestly evident how much he had declined in just a few short years.
Well, and Krystal, one of the interesting things about your perspective is that you saw old media and you've been a leader in new media. And I guess from the perspective of people watching this at home, how different is new media from old media, especially with the context you just described about Morning Joe losing the credibility with their own audience? I mean, it sounds silly, I guess, to talk about people who watched 4 hours of Morning Joe every day for years and felt like they knew the Morning Joe crew and family and were part of something. That actually is, people's relationship with TV actually is like that. And that sense of credibility and authenticity, whether you're on MSNBC or Breaking Points, is important. So what is different in the time that we're in now from the height of the cable news era?
I am skeptical that what is going to come out of the ashes of mainstream media's destruction is actually going to be superior, because in some ways the bad incentives of corporate legacy media also exist in alternative media spaces. In corporate media, obviously, one of the big problems is just the closeness of the advertisers. So you are never going to see like an anti-capitalist perspective, because that undermines the whole project of being capitalist that you're going to see at corporate media enterprises. So, whether it's the pharmaceutical ads Then there's the piece of access journalism and wanting to make sure you're not pissing off power, at least of whatever partisan side you're sort of cheerleading on that network, whether it's Fox News and the Republicans or MSNBC and Democrats. And, a lot of those same problems exist in a lot of new media where there's similar desire for access, similar desire for partisan cheerleading. There's actually more of a problem of audience capture where people don't want to say anything that may be true but is uncomfortable for their audience because that parasocial relationship and the relationship between what you say and what your audience thinks about it and your bottom line is much more closely linked. And, in mainstream media or legacy media, there is a wall between the people who are selling the ads and the hosts and the talent who are, delivering the news or giving their commentary. In a lot of independent media or alt media spaces, there is no wall there. So while I think there is a possibility of something that would be better, more honest, more responsive, etc., and just a lower barrier to entry as well. So you have more people who are able to, be journalists, be active, engaged voices in these new media spaces. I'm ultimately pretty skeptical that what's going to be built is superior. And one of the kind of core business reasons is that, and you know this, Emily, the cheapest thing to do is what I do, right? Just basically like go out and say what I think about things. And, I think there's a space for that. I hope there's a space for that. But we also need genuine journalism. We need people who will go and travel and be on the ground. And those investigative enterprises are more expensive. They are more fraught with risk because sometimes you chase a lead that doesn't pan out. And if that is all lost, I think we will be the worse for it. So while, like I said, I'm not sad that MSNBC is going away. I think they've been a very pernicious force, one of the most pernicious forces in the Democratic Party in enforcing this kind of orthodoxy. I also am leery of their demise and skeptical that what is going to come in its wake is going to ultimately be superior. But I guess what you could say is at least now there's a possibility for something different.
I was going to ask for your prediction, but it's just so hard to predict what happens to MSNBC, especially we haven't talked about how they're now being separated from NBC News, which I know you have insight into why that's so critical because so much of MSNBC was built on NBC News, meaning that was sort of their news gathering. It was brilliant in the height of the cable news era to build something like MSNBC because you already had NBC News and you could just sort of feed back and forth with the two of them, but now they don't have that. Elon Musk is, I don't know how seriously, flirting with buying MSNBC, but somebody can swoop in and try to build something from the ashes of what is MSNBC right now. The ratings are really terrible. That's not just MSNBC. Even, Fox News has great ratings compared to MSNBC and CNN, but not compared to earlier times in the history of cable news. So what's your sense about what could happen with MSNBC, Krystal?
I mean, I think for sure they will never occupy the space that they did before as being the primary outlet of liberal Democratic Party consensus making. And I do think that's a positive because I do think that they've been a deeply destructive force and have really blocked the ideology and like a left populist class first movement that would have been the most effective challenge to Donald Trump. So I think they have nuked their credibility so much that that era is over. It's very consequential that they won't have the NBC News journalistic resources behind them. And if you think about, Election Day, a lot of people tune into MSNBC because they got Kornacki, they've got all the data gurus in the background, crunching the data, et cetera. Those are NBC resources that they're relying on there. The one thing cable news continues to have a real sort of hold on the market is in live breaking news. Something crazy happened somewhere in the world. They've got a reporter there on the ground. They have some sort of intel that they can pull. They're not going to have that anymore. So now they're just in, the game of like hot takes, opinion making, etc. And there's a lot of fierce competition for that. So I think that they've suffered a significant blow. I think that the spinoff is going to be difficult for them to sustain any sort of real purchase on American society, any sort of like real sway with elite opinion makers. So I think it's pretty dire for them. in terms of the future.
Here's my last question. Do any of these people believe what they say? And I that is a serious question, because I think some of them, there's this misconception that they're just reading off scripts and they'll do whatever the bosses say. But what happens is, it seems to me at least, you would know better, they come to believe sort of the spin. They come to really believe in it. And this is Joe Scarborough talking about how now he's a capitalist, but with guardrails, a week after getting smacked in the ratings and smacked around by his own viewers because he went and kissed the ring at Mar-a-Lago, and starting to like flirt again with populism. Do they believe what they're saying, or are they literally just making it up on the fly?
Some do and some don't, I would say. I mean, I think Joe and Mika, to my view, are particularly shameless and just doing whatever they need to do to promote themselves and remain close to power. So for most of them, though, it's either they come to believe what they say, or else they're there because what they genuinely believe is very comfortable for the executives and, that the shareholders and the sort of elite media class. People like Ed Schultz, people like myself, people had differing views. We didn't last long at the network. So there's also a selection bias in favor of people who genuinely believe these views that are very comfortable for mainstream Democratic establishment politicians.
Krystal Ball, thank you so much for stopping by and sharing all of your insights on this. I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Emily.
It was great to have Krystal here, and if you've listened to me talk about media before, I always go back to the same analogy, and I'm starting to have to preface it by that. I'm starting to have to preface it that way now, because I talk about this all the time, but it's the difference between Stephen Colbert and Johnny Carson is the difference between the news media in the era of Johnny Carson and the news media in the era of Stephen Colbert. Johnny Carson had to appeal to the biggest audience possible to have good ratings as the host of a late night comedy show. And that meant your politics had to appeal to the most people possible as well. So you had to, not really turn off viewers from one side or the other. Colbert was the most popular late night host until Greg Gutfeld came along during the Trump administration, despite being like the least comedic and the most partisan. This is the exact opposite of the Johnny Carson model. Johnny Carson would be political, but he wouldn't be partisan. And so what's happened with this proliferation of options is that you can afford to turn people off from your show, because what you need to do when you're all competing for a smaller slice of the pie, Stephen Colbert maybe needs to get a couple million people around there to tune in night after night to win the late night ratings battle. And, it would have been unthinkable for a cable network to outpace Johnny Carson. You would need to put up crazy numbers, north of like 10 million to win the late night battle during different points of his tenure. But you don't need to do that anymore. You need to corner a niche, and you need to cultivate the most loyal audience possible and the biggest of the most loyal audience possible, if that makes sense. And for Stephen Colbert, it was the resistance. He could keep the resistance coming back night after night, and that was enough to edge out Jimmy Fallon and Jimmy Kimmel. And eventually they all kind of tried to do that, even though the obvious business move would be to do something different, in order to get a different slice of the pie from everyone who's already going to Colbert. But that's what we're seeing. I mean, cable news has always been that way. It was always, it was never going to like really outpace the broadcast when it first came into being. But it was, we can get a really specific type of audience. And as they sort of realized what that could do for their content, they started to swerve into these different niches. It's like what MSNBC did during the Iraq War, frankly. Fox News figured this out earlier than the other networks, and has seen a lot of success because of it. Granted, there's nobody else really competing with them in that space in the same way that MSNBC and CNN maybe compete with each other. You'd rant all day about how CNN has a clear lane in the center, that they could, do a pretty good job in the ratings game, even if it was slightly more boring, because there are enough people in this world who just want boring news, that CNN could do okay if they just went down with that demographic. But this is why the business of media is so important to understanding the content and the coverage. And I thought Krystal's point about how this could actually change the Democratic Party and how influential MSNBC was on shaping the Democratic Party is really the important big picture takeaway from all of this. So thank you for tuning in. I'll stop ranting now. We are here every weekday, Monday through Friday. So make sure to subscribe on the Undercurrents channel. Subscribe wherever you download your podcast. There's an audio version that we put out every single day as well, and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll be back with more soon.